If there's one thing that remains underappreciated by gamers as a whole, it's the startup screen. A simple jingle and image can help set the tone for a system and how it feels. Is it fun, family-friendly, and lighthearted, or is it serious, sophisticated, and designed for the more mature gamer? The startup screen can tell us a lot about that, and today we're going to tell you about them. If we're talking about anything to do with the history of games consoles, we have to start with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Actually, we should call it the Famicom because that's what it was called when it came out in Japan in 1983. While there had been some consoles before it, this was the one which ended up changing everything. It was a massive success, and it came out in other countries as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short, a couple of years later. It was a joy to plug it in, turn it on, and play. There wasn't a startup screen with the NES, but there was if you lived in Japan and got one of its peripherals. The Family Computer Disk System took what the NES did and made its games bigger through the use of a floppy disk. You may not know this, but some Nintendo classics like Metroid and The Legend of Zelda were initially Family Computer Disk System games. Their regular NES appearance saw them use passwords rather than game saves. Anyway, the exciting news for Family Computer Disk System players is it had its own startup screen, and it was great. A rousing 8-bit fanfare played, and we'll come back to the music later, before Mario and Luigi started flicking the light switch and took part in a mini battle while you made sure you'd put the disc in properly. It may not have looked like much, but it was kind of groundbreaking. Of course, Nintendo have always been the sort of company not to rest on their laurels, and with technology moving on, it was inevitable they'd make a bigger and better successor to the NES. Well, as we're sure you probably know already, they did. It was called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short, although in Japan, it was called the Super Famicom, for obvious reasons. Again, this didn't really have a startup screen as such, although 713 made a pretty cool mock-up of what it could have looked like, soundtracked by the end-of-level music from Super Mario World. It makes use of the SNES logo, which was based around its then revolutionary 4-button gamepad. It might sound weird now, but at the time, it was crazy. Those controllers were also way more comfortable to use than the NES, which were kind of rectangular and uncomfortable. Oh, and the shoulder buttons were genuinely pioneering. While the regular SNES may not have had a startup screen, a peripheral did. The Satellaview came out in 1995, and it was a pretty big deal in Japan. It was a satellite modem, which meant you could use your Super Famicom to go and download games and magazines. Pretty groundbreaking at the time. It also doubles up as the intro to the game BSX, the story of the town whose name was stolen. That's an interesting title. We love it. It has some pretty rad twinkly 16-bit music, as well as what looks like a cityscape at either sunrise or sunset. It shows the Nintendo logo before scrolling across to reveal the game's title. Even though Stellaview never really did anything out of Japan, it had an awesome loading screen and was a pioneering peripheral device. Now, you may well be thinking that at this point, the very concept of a startup screen for Nintendo consoles were solely the province of gamers who lived in Japan and liked peripherals. This is where you'd be incredibly wrong. You see, one of the biggest gateways into gaming came in the form of the Nintendo Game Boy. This unassuming lump of white plastic came out in 1989 and ended up going everywhere. The idea of an actual games console, not just one single game, but a console which let you play a wide variety of games anywhere you wanted to, was revolutionary. So were the control buttons. They were slightly offset, unlike on the NES controller, which meant they were a little bit more comfortable to reach and use. The other revolutionary thing, though, was the startup screen. First off, it had one. If you hadn't been digging the disk system on the Famicom, or if you weren't from Japan, or you hadn't played video games before, this was something different. Sure, by the standards of today, it wasn't much, but it was something. The Nintendo logo scrolled down the screen, and when it got to the center, it made a very satisfying ping noise. Seriously, the ping was great. It meant the game you were excited to play, and you could play pretty much anywhere, let's not forget, was about to start. It would be wrong, we think, to say the startup screen made people lose their minds. But we reckon if you played that ping, which really was more of a pudding to pretty much anyone born between 1973 and 1985, they'd be able to tell you exactly what it was. While other early handheld consoles had bigger specs, they could play games in color for a start, Nintendo's system was strong enough that it was a bigger success than any of them. Pudding indeed. Of course, the thing about console gaming in the late 1980s and early 1990s is that Nintendo, while being massive, was not the only big dog in the yard. Sega was their main rivals, and the Nintendo versus Sega wars left a mark on gamers which can still lead to some heated debates even today. The Sega Game Gear was a masterpiece of portable gaming technology, which led people onto the company in droves. Its first major selling point was, unlike the Game Boy, it could play games with color. In fact, it was really a portable version of the Sega Master System. It's worth mentioning the Sega Master System here because we think it kind of gets overlooked by gaming historians. It was Sega's answer to the NES, and unlike many of the 8-bit rivals, it was actually able to hold its own. This was in part due to an excellent range of games, most notably the Alex Kidd franchise, and some pretty cool graphics and sounds. It was certainly capable of more than the NES, so in Japan and Europe, it emerged as a genuine competitor. Anyway, the thing Sega did that Nintendo didn't, to paraphrase the ad campaign for the Master System, was to have a startup screen. Again, it wasn't a mind-blowing thing, but it was a thing. The Sega logo slid onto the screen, coupled with an electronic bloop. This is another one of those things which gamers of a certain age will recognize. It wasn't big or complex, but it did do the job of telling you that you were about to play something on the Sega Master System. If you were in Japan, where it was called the Mark III, it was even better. Some jolly music played as a checkerboard that changed color scrolled in a parallax form at the bottom. The Sega Game Gear was a great little console, and again, it kinda gets overlooked. If you got an adapter, you could even play Master System games on it. Admittedly, this made it a little less portable than it usually was, but it did open up the world of Sega gaming. You also had full color, which, while looking awesome, did have a downside. You see, it was very, very likely your batteries would drain quickly. If you didn't get rechargeable ones, you could find yourself spending a lot of money on it. Now, while the Game Boy pretty much wiped the floor with the Game Gear in the end when it came to sales, we loved the Sega System's startup screen. The Game Gear lights up with a screen telling you that it is indeed made by Sega. Then, to ram the point home, the Sega logo appears, accompanied by, get this, Sonic the Hedgehog. At the same time, an electronic choir sings Sega. Those of us who remember these things remember the old digitized voices and are probably feeling incredibly nostalgic right now. When it comes to the Nintendo versus Sega rivalry and how and why things got so heated, there's only one word. Okay, depending on where you are in the world, it might be a different one. We'll say Genesis, but if you're not from North America, what we mean is Mega Drive. Anyway, whatever you call it, Sega's 16-bit console was revolutionary. No one had ever seen anything quite like it when it came out in 1988. Remember, the Super Nintendo was some ways away, and the 16-bit graphics and sounds were superior to anything else on the market. Sega also managed to get themselves a startup screen too. The blue logo flashed across your television as the digitized choir, now with a 16-bit clarity, sang the manufacturer's name. Sega was the sort of company to always be tweaking and improving their product, and later editions of their 16-bit powerhouse had a slightly different startup screen to go with the firm's new branding and mascot. After about 1992, if you got a shiny new Genesis or Mega Drive, you'd get something a little different. The screen featured Sonic the Hedgehog, who was, by now, a gaming icon to rival or even, in those days, surpass Mario for sheer ubiquity, running back and forth as the company logo appeared and the choir sang Sega. While it doesn't seem like much now, it was incredibly exciting for the time. You knew you were in for some high-speed gaming shenanigans. Even after the Super Nintendo took things to a whole new level, Sega's machine was still the quickest by some margin, and Sonic's speed really highlighted that. While Nintendo and Sega were duking it out in a gaming contest to end all gaming contests, one thing was clear: video game consoles were a big deal. and they weren't going away anytime soon. Some people had thought they were a fad and they'd go away, but that wasn't happening. As technology developed, it meant games got bigger, looked better, and sounded nicer, but they needed increasingly more capable consoles to deliver their greatness. While the biggest players were, of course, Sega and Nintendo, other businesses who made tech equipment were looking at them and wondering how they could get their hands on a slice of the gaming pie. The one company that was smart enough to know what was going on, big enough to create a new console that was going to create interest rather than bewilderment, fast enough to release it quickly, and skilled enough to make something worth play was, of course, Sony. In truth, the PlayStation had been in the pipeline for quite some time. Sony had originally looked to create the Super NES CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo in partnership with Nintendo all the way back in 1988. But for a variety of reasons, the SNES add-on never quite saw the light of day. Then in 1991, after severing their ties with Nintendo following the company's surprise switch to Philips to create the Philips CDI, there were plans for Sony to create their own console. The seeds of the idea were sown, and soon enough, it was announced that Sony were going to enter into the world of gaming consoles. As trite and cliched as it may sound, the world of gaming would never be the same again. Now, imagine this. It's the middle of the 90s, and you've managed to save your money and take a plunge on the new Sony PlayStation. You take it home from the shop. Online shopping was very much in its infancy then, so chances were you'd be leaving your home to pick it up, put the correct wires in the correct bits of your TV, get the game on a disc out of its box, put it in, and switch your new console on. What greets you is absolutely mind-blowing. The PlayStation's technical specifications blew its rivals clean out of the water. The sounds were so much better and varied. Sports games came with commentary, while lots of games had actual songs on them, and the graphics were, for the time, amazing. Hey, they may look super blocky now, but at the time, the polygons were mind-blowing. Turning the system on for the first time, you'd get a little hint of this. The Sony Computer Entertainment logo looked like it was taken from a photograph rather than being a collection of pixels. The audio sounded, for want of a better word, real, rather than being digitized and bitty. Once you'd seen and heard that, it changed again to the now familiar red, yellow, green, and blue PS logo. If you weren't looking forward to playing your games beforehand, you would be incredibly excited right about now. It was a subtle little thing, but it helped drive the point home. The Sony PlayStation wasn't your average console. It was the future, not only of gaming, but also of home entertainment. Other companies were getting their responses to Sony's entrance into the market ready though. Sega had already preempted it with a 32-bit console, the Saturn. While it was a good system, it never reached the heights of its predecessor, hampered as it was by rather complex hardware. It had an interesting startup screen though. It replaced the old voices with a silky sound effect and silver parts coming together to form the Saturn's logo. It was more sophisticated, less cartoony, and more grown up than previous examples from Sega, and looked like it was heralding in a new age. Nintendo, on the other hand, was doing what it's always done best, coming up with great consoles for the whole family. The Japanese legends skipped the 32-bit era and went right for the jugular with a 64-bit system, as the numbers in the name of 1996 Nintendo 64 would indicate. While the N64 didn't have its own startup screen, if you got your hands on the 64DD, which was a disk drive add-on for the N64, then you witnessed one of the all-time great startup screens. First, a cube-like N came on the screen. Then it was colored in, and Mario put his head round the corner from behind it and waved. Then he came out, kicked the N into the air, and scampered around it. It was in a 3D style format, and it helped give a hint to gamers what they could expect from their new console, all while keeping the traditional Nintendo feel to it. In the world of handhelds, Nintendo issued a sequel to the Game Boy. This portable games machine was like its predecessor, only it was able to play games with color. Imaginatively, it was called the Game Boy Color. Its startup screen was simple and to the point. Game Boy flashed on screen in colored letters, while the ping from the original Game Boy soundtracked it. Its follow-up, the Game Boy Advance, may have had its 32-bit processor, but kept things similar. This time, the letters moved, and there was a chime before the familiar ping. It's easily one of the most iconic startup screens of all time. Moving into the 21st century, video game consoles were getting more and more popular, as well as more and more advanced. Before we get there, it's time to take the time to say farewell to an icon of console gaming. Sega had taken a bit of a hit with the Saturn because the PlayStation was so popular, so it wasn't too long after it came out that Sega released a follow-up. Kickstarting the 6th generation of consoles in 1998, the Dreamcast looked set to take over the world. It was more capable than anything else which had come before it. Unfortunately, things didn't quite work out. While it was the first console of its era, the ones following it were cheaper. This forced Sega to keep discounting it until it barely made any money. Coupled with other systems having more and better games, alongside a faction at Sega's head office who wanted to focus solely on game development, its days were numbered. It was discounted in 2001, with Sega now solely being a games developer. It was kind of sad. If you wanted to say hello rather than goodbye to a Dreamcast, you had a lovely startup screen. An orange ball bounced, and where it landed, the letters spelling Dreamcast would appear. Then the ball would turn into the system's orange spiral logo. A cool startup and early online connectivity couldn't save the Dreamcast though. One of the biggest suspects in the death of the Dreamcast was Sony. They had some massive success with their PlayStation, so it was time for a sequel. In 2000, the PlayStation 2 turned up, bigger and badder than before, and was the system for a new millennium. Not only could you play bigger and better games than before, it also served as a DVD player, helping the new technology enter people's homes and finishing off the much beloved VHS videotape in the process. Whether it was games or movies, you had the same startup. A group of blocks, kind of like a city from above, loomed into view before you were dragged into them and the screen went black. Then you saw the words PlayStation 2 and you were good to go. In the world of games, there are some people who prefer playing on a computer. We're not going into that debate now, but since Microsoft created Windows, which was the OS for most PCs, it was inevitable that sooner or later, someone in Seattle was going to cross over. This happened in 2001 when the Microsoft Xbox, using a processor you'd find in a PC, launched and got Sony looking over their shoulders. When you turned it on, you saw green flashing and lighting what looked like a laboratory before the camera suddenly zoomed out and revealed the trademark X. There was also an ominous sound effect which got people rather excited. Meanwhile, Nintendo were still very much in the game, with their old rivals Sega now reduced to making games which appeared on their systems. Seriously, gamers of a certain age still can't get over seeing Sonic and Mario at the same time. The company made a savvy decision. Rather than trying to match Sony and Microsoft, they'd make sure they were the best at family-friendly systems. Their GameCube came out in 2002 and surprisingly wasn't anywhere near as successful as they'd hoped. Sure, it sold more than 20 million units, but that was less than half of what Nintendo had hoped for. Fans still love it though, and the startup was part of that. A purple cube came on the screen and wrote out the letter G as uplifting music played. Once again, it's one of the most well-remembered startup screens of all time. Nintendo is pretty good at these. Nintendo were still the masters of handhelds though, as 2004's DS showed. Making use of two screens, it became a phenomenon. It had a simple but memorable startup screen, the logo turned up while a chime played, and you were ready to go. The DS was launched in response to Sony's PlayStation Portable, or PSP. This started up with a little melody before the screen showed a green wave and the system's logo came up. It wasn't an impressive startup, but it was an impressive games machine. While the handhelds were competing against each other, it was time to look for the next generation of the bigger consoles. It was Microsoft who came out of the gate quickest, launching their Xbox 360 in November 2005. This was a whole new thing, and with Microsoft getting a march on their rivals, it did very well. As far as startups went, it had an interesting one. There was a green X in a sphere, which opened up to reveal the logo. The cool thing was that when Microsoft reissued the system in 2010, it got a new startup, this time with the green trail swooshing round to end up in the ball. The PlayStation 3 had better graphics, better sound, more space, and a hard drive you could save games on. This meant no more memory cards. It also had access to the PlayStation Network, which meant players could play online a heck of a lot easier and for free. For its startup, it struck a note on strings, with Sony's logo coming up. When the Slim model was unveiled in 2009, it was slightly different. The cord changed and the PS3's logo appeared instead of Sony's. Either way, once it was done, it was time for some games which are still being played today. A week after the PS3 was released, Nintendo struck with the Wii. This was quite unlike anything else we'd seen. Rather than sitting down to play games, the system's controller got you to control the games by moving around and performing actions. When Nintendo did this, they did something no one else had done, and people who wouldn't have otherwise played video games got in on the action too. To say the Wii's startup was simple was an understatement. A healthy warning, then a sound, which became the object of many a meme, and you were straight into the main menu. It really was as straightforward as that. With the Wii proving a success, Nintendo went out and added their inventory of innovation with the 3DS, a handheld system which played games in 3 dimensions. This was definitely something new, exciting, and groundbreaking. Launched in 2010, it soon became a hit, especially when people realized they could play their old DS games on it. Its startup wasn't too dissimilar to the DS. This time though, there was a different noise, and there was a black background and red lettering. Oh, and it popped out at you too. Even Sony threw their hat back into the handheld console ring with the PS Vita. The handheld console completely flopped, but it was an incredibly premium portable device that was often used as a second screen for PS4 games. Its startup was simple. There were sounds like water drops in the background, while a few screens showed up, including Sony, Sony Computer Entertainment, and finally, PS Vita. Staying with Nintendo, the company then did something it hadn't done in a while. Previously, it hadn't really been the first game maker to come up with a new console for a new generation. Their systems were typically so popular, they were still able to keep supporting them and making games for them. This changed when the Wii U was launched in 2012. It was like a regular Wii, but it also had a gamepad with an embedded touchscreen, which changed things up. In truth, it was a huge failure that Nintendo didn't even think was possible, but it was a good system. Its startup was pretty cool. It mainly appeared on your gamepad screen, but could also show on your TV. It was simple but effective, with chimes playing as the logo emerged onto a white background. Meanwhile, the confusingly named Xbox One was in development and became one of the biggest things ever as soon as it was released in 2013. Gamers loved it, and they were greeted with a startup screen which was quick and simple. The Xbox logo came up, the sound chimed, the Microsoft logo came up, and there you were. It was a similar story the same year with the PS4. While this was, for many, the last word in gaming technology, at least for the time being, the intro was quick. There was some calming music, a message welcoming you back to your PS4, and that was it. It was a similar story for the PS4 Pro too. While the hardware had changed slightly, the intro hadn't. In 2017, Nintendo unveiled the Nintendo Switch, which squared the circle and served as a handheld device and a traditional console all at the same time. Turning it on, you'd be greeted with another masterclass of simplicity. The red and white logo appeared before one of the console's controllers slipped down, and a jingle with the promise of many exciting things happened. This was supposed to be the startup every time, but was only the startup for the first time you booted up the system. We actually just ended up with a little news section on the left-hand side and a prompt to press A to continue, but we still love it nonetheless. And those were some of the most interesting video game console startup screens. We hope you enjoyed it. What's your favorite startup screen? Why is it your favorite? Did we miss any good ones? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to The Gamer for more gaming content. Thanks for watching.